The day I buried my husband, I learned that grief wasn't the only thing people were willing to leave at a graveside. Some people leave behind respect too. The sky over Cedar Heights Cemetery was grey and heavy, the kind of late October afternoon that made everything feel colder than it really was. I stood beside Robert's casket with trembling hands wrapped around a single white rose, trying to understand how 40 years of marriage could end in one silent goodbye. Friends offered condolences. Neighbors hugged me. People spoke about Robert's kindness, his work ethic, and the way he never walked past someone who needed help. I heard every word, yet somehow none of them felt real. The only thing I could think about was the empty chair waiting for me at home. After the service, small groups gathered near the parking lot, talking quietly before heading back to their lives. I stayed behind for a moment, staring at the fresh earth. That was when I heard a voice I recognized. Melissa. My daughter-in-law. She thought I was too far away to hear her. Once she's gone, everything is ours, she said in a low voice. A few people laughed awkwardly. Someone changed the subject. But I had heard enough. Every word landed harder than the cold wind. I turned slightly and saw her standing beside Jason, my son. He didn't correct her. He didn't look shocked. He simply stared at the ground. For a second, I wondered if grief was playing tricks on me. Surely I had misunderstood. Surely no one would speak that way on the day of Robert's funeral. But the look on Melissa's face told me otherwise. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't sympathy. It was calculation. The ride home was quiet. Jason offered to drive me. Melissa sat in the front seat scrolling through her phone. Every few minutes she turned around and asked if I was doing okay. Her concern sounded rehearsed, as if she were reading lines from a script. When we arrived at my house, she insisted on carrying my bag. She offered to organize my medications. She even suggested staying the night. A stranger might have called it kindness. To me, it felt different. It felt sudden. Forced. As I stood in my kitchen later that evening, staring at the family photographs covering the walls, I replayed her words over and over. Once she's gone, everything is ours. What exactly was everything? Robert and I had never lived extravagantly. We drove practical cars. We lived in the same home for decades. We rarely talked about money. Yet something in Melissa's confidence bothered me. She sounded less like someone hoping for an inheritance and more like someone expecting one. That night, after everyone left, I sat alone in the silence of the house Robert and I had built together. The clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a light rain tapped against the windows. For the first time all day, I allowed myself to cry. But beneath the sadness, another feeling quietly began to grow. A feeling I couldn't ignore. Suspicion. Over the next 2 weeks, something strange happened. Jason and Melissa became the most attentive people I had ever seen. They called every morning before breakfast. They called again before dinner. If I did not answer within 10 minutes, one of them would text asking if I was feeling well. At first, I told myself they were grieving too. Maybe Robert's death had reminded them how fragile life could be. Maybe they genuinely cared. But the feeling of unease that had settled into my chest after the funeral never went away. One Tuesday afternoon, Melissa arrived with 2 grocery bags filled with food. She stocked my refrigerator, wiped down my kitchen counters, and even offered to organize the paperwork on my dining room table. She smiled the entire time. "We just want to make things easier for you, Emily," she said. I thanked her, but something about the way her eyes lingered on every envelope and every folder made me uncomfortable. A few days later, Jason stopped by after work. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and asked questions that seemed harmless at first. Had I updated my will recently? Did I still want to maintain such a large property by myself? Had Robert left detailed financial records? The questions came one after another. I noticed he never asked how I was sleeping. He never asked whether I missed his father. Somehow every conversation drifted toward money, property, or paperwork. One evening, Melissa invited me to dinner at their house. Throughout the meal she kept mentioning retirement communities. She described beautiful facilities with walking trails, fitness centers, and organized social events. People your age love those places, she said with a bright smile. No stress. No maintenance. No worries. Jason nodded in agreement. I forced a smile and changed the subject. The following weekend, they arrived together carrying brochures. They spread them across my coffee table as if they were presenting a business proposal. Melissa pointed to photographs of smiling seniors playing cards and gardening. Jason explained how much easier life could be if I downsized. Then Melissa casually mentioned selling my house. The comment was delivered so smoothly that she probably thought I would not notice it. But I did. Every word felt rehearsed. Every suggestion seemed to move toward the same destination. Sell the house. Move somewhere smaller. Simplify your life. As they spoke, I looked around my living room. Robert had painted the bookshelves with his own hands. The grandfather clock had belonged to his father. The framed photographs captured decades of birthdays, holidays, and ordinary moments that meant everything to me. This house was not simply a piece of property. It was my life. After they left, I stood by the front window and watched their car disappear down the street. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Melissa had accidentally left one of her folders behind. It had slipped beneath the couch. I picked it up and intended to return it unopened. But a loose sheet of paper slid out onto the floor. Across the top was a handwritten list. My house was mentioned. Several other assets were listed beneath it. And beside each item were estimated dollar amounts. I stared at the page for a long moment. Then I carefully placed it back into the folder. For the first time, I stopped wondering whether my suspicions were unfair. Deep down, I already knew the answer. The discovery changed everything. I did not confront Jason or Melissa. I did not mention the folder or the list of assets. Instead, I decided to watch and listen. Sometimes people reveal more when they believe you know nothing. Over the following days, the pressure became impossible to ignore. Jason began calling almost every evening. At first, he asked about my health. Within minutes, the conversation always turned toward practical matters. He spoke about reducing expenses, simplifying responsibilities, and planning for the future. One night he suggested that managing a property at my age could become overwhelming. Another evening he mentioned how much money I could save by moving into a smaller place. The pattern was becoming obvious. Melissa was even more direct. She stopped pretending the retirement community was just an option. Now she talked about it as though the decision had already been made. She brought additional brochures. She highlighted amenities with a bright yellow marker. She pointed out apartment layouts and monthly pricing. Every visit felt less like a family conversation and more like a sales presentation. One Saturday morning, they arrived unexpectedly with coffee and pastries. We sat around the kitchen table where Robert and I had shared thousands of meals over 4 decades. Melissa placed a folder in front of me. "We have been thinking about what is best for you," she said. The sentence immediately put me on guard. People often use those words when they are really talking about what is best for themselves. Jason opened the folder and showed me several pages. There were market estimates for my house. There were projected sale prices. There were calculations showing how much money could be generated if certain assets were liquidated. I noticed that neither of them asked whether I wanted to sell anything. They simply assumed the conversation should begin there. I listened quietly while they explained their ideas. Melissa spoke confidently about financial efficiency. Jason talked about reducing stress. The entire presentation lasted nearly 40 minutes. When they finally finished, I asked a simple question. "Did your father ever tell either of you what he wanted for me after he was gone?" The room fell silent. Jason looked down at the table. Melissa forced a smile. Neither of them had an answer. That silence told me more than any speech could have. Robert had always been protective. He never worried about himself. He worried about the people he loved. If he had anticipated this situation, I suspected he would have made preparations. Later that night, after Jason and Melissa left, I walked into Robert's home office. For weeks I had avoided the room because everything inside reminded me of him. His reading glasses still rested on the desk. His favorite pen sat beside a stack of notebooks. The familiar scent of old books lingered in the air. I slowly opened drawers and sorted through documents, searching for nothing in particular. Then I noticed a small wooden box tucked behind several folders. It was something I had never seen before. My heart began to race. Inside the box was a sealed envelope with my name written on the front in Robert's unmistakable handwriting. Beneath it was a business card for a man named Harrison Wells, attorney at law. Suddenly, I remembered the confidence Robert always carried when discussing the future. As I stared at the envelope, I realized there was a very good chance that my husband had known something I did not. For several minutes, I simply stared at the envelope. My hands trembled as I traced the familiar handwriting. Robert had always been organized, but he was not secretive. If he had gone out of his way to leave something hidden, there had to be a reason. I carefully broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The first line brought tears to my eyes. My dearest Emily, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer there to protect you in person. I sat down in his chair and continued reading. Robert wrote about our years together, our family, and the life we had built. Then the tone of the letter changed. He explained that people sometimes reveal their true character when money enters the conversation. He said that if I ever felt pressured, manipulated, or isolated after his passing, I should not make any major decisions until I spoke with Harrison Wells. The attorney's name appeared twice in the letter. Robert had underlined it. Near the bottom, he wrote something that immediately caught my attention. There are matters concerning our future that only Harrison can fully explain. I read the sentence 3 times. Matters concerning our future. The wording was deliberate. Robert had chosen every word carefully throughout our marriage. I knew he would not have written that unless it carried real meaning. The next morning, I called the number on the business card. A receptionist answered and transferred me almost immediately. When Harrison Wells came on the line, his voice softened the moment I introduced myself. Mrs. Carter, he said, I have been expecting your call for quite some time. My heart skipped a beat. Expecting my call. That meant Robert had prepared something long before his death. Harrison suggested we meet in person. He offered to come to my house, but I preferred to visit his office. 2 days later, I drove downtown and entered a quiet brick building overlooking the river. Harrison greeted me personally and led me into a conference room. Several folders sat neatly arranged on the table. Before opening any of them, he asked me a question. Has anyone been pressuring you to make financial decisions? I hesitated for a moment before describing Jason and Melissa's recent behavior. Harrison listened without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded slowly as though my answer confirmed something he already suspected. Then he opened one of the folders. Robert loved you very much, he said. He also wanted to make certain that you would always have control over your own future. My pulse quickened. For the next hour, Harrison reviewed documents that seemed increasingly important, though he stopped short of revealing everything. Some records required additional verification. Other matters, he explained, would be discussed during a formal meeting later. What mattered most was his advice. He told me not to sign anything. He told me not to sell anything. And most importantly, he told me to remain patient. As I prepared to leave, Harrison handed me a sealed packet and said there would soon be a family meeting. Walking back to my car, I felt something I had not felt since Robert died. It was not happiness. It was not relief. It was certainty. Whatever secret my husband had left behind, it was far bigger than Jason and Melissa could possibly imagine. 3 days later, the invitation arrived. Jason called and told me the family wanted to get together on Sunday afternoon to discuss long-term plans. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. Melissa followed up with a text message describing it as a simple family meeting where everyone could help me make important decisions. I already knew it would be much more than that. Harrison had warned me that patience would reveal everything, and I had no intention of disrupting whatever they believed was about to happen. Sunday arrived with clear skies and cool autumn air. The meeting was held in a private conference room inside a modern commercial building downtown. As I stepped out of the elevator, I immediately noticed how confident Melissa seemed. She greeted relatives near the entrance as though she were hosting a corporate event. Several members of Robert's extended family had been invited. A few family friends were there as well. The room buzzed with quiet conversations and polite smiles. Melissa walked over and gave me a quick hug. "We are all here because we care about you," she said. I thanked her and took a seat near the end of the large conference table. From my chair, I watched everything. Jason stood near a projection screen reviewing documents. Melissa carried a binder filled with charts and printed reports. Neither of them seemed nervous. In fact, they looked excited. That alone told me a great deal. As more people arrived, I overheard fragments of conversation. Someone mentioned real estate values. Another person discussed investment opportunities. A cousin asked whether certain properties would eventually be sold. It became increasingly clear that many people expected major financial decisions to be announced. The meeting officially began shortly after 2 o'clock. Jason welcomed everyone and spoke about family unity. He thanked people for supporting me after Robert's passing. Then he shifted the conversation toward practical concerns. He explained that managing assets could become difficult for someone in my situation. Melissa followed with a polished presentation. Slide after slide appeared on the screen. There were estimates, projections, maintenance costs, and recommendations. Everything pointed toward the same conclusion. According to them, the smartest solution was to consolidate assets, simplify ownership, and place management responsibilities in younger hands. Several relatives nodded along. A few even praised Jason and Melissa for being so responsible. Throughout the presentation, I remained silent. That seemed to encourage them. They interpreted my silence as agreement. Near the end, Melissa opened her binder and removed a stack of documents. "We only want what is best for Emily," she told the room. "These papers will make everything easier for her." Then she placed the documents directly in front of me. The room grew quiet. All eyes turned toward my side of the table. Jason smiled reassuringly. Melissa uncapped a pen and slid it across the polished surface. The moment felt carefully staged, almost rehearsed. They believed the final step was about to happen. They believed I would sign whatever they placed in front of me. I glanced at the papers without touching them. Then I looked toward the conference room door. Harrison had told me not to worry. He had told me to wait. And at that exact moment, the door opened. The room fell silent as Harrison Wells stepped inside carrying a leather briefcase. Several people glanced at one another with puzzled expressions. Jason looked confused. Melissa looked annoyed. Neither of them had expected an interruption. Harrison closed the door behind him and calmly walked toward the conference table. His confidence immediately changed the atmosphere. He greeted me with a respectful smile before taking a seat beside me. "Thank you for waiting," he said. Traffic was heavier than expected. Jason cleared his throat and attempted to regain control of the meeting. "I am sorry," he said, "but who exactly are you?" Harrison opened his briefcase and removed a business card. "My name is Harrison Wells. I served as legal counsel for Robert Carter for many years." The moment Robert's name was mentioned, the room became noticeably quieter. Melissa folded her arms. Jason exchanged a quick glance with her. Neither of them seemed comfortable. Harrison then placed several folders on the table. Before any documents are signed today, there are matters that need clarification. Melissa quickly responded. We are only trying to help Emily manage things more efficiently. Harrison nodded politely. I understand. However, efficiency is not the primary issue. He looked directly at me. Mrs. Carter, would you like me to proceed? I answered with a simple yes. Harrison opened the first folder and began reviewing legal records. Most people around the table struggled to understand the significance of the paperwork. The documents referenced trusts, ownership structures, property management agreements, and long-standing financial arrangements. Jason appeared increasingly uncomfortable as Harrison continued speaking. Several times he tried to interrupt with questions, but Harrison remained focused on the records. Melissa's confidence slowly faded. The smile she had worn throughout the meeting disappeared entirely. Then Harrison revealed something unexpected. Robert had spent years preparing detailed plans to ensure that I would maintain complete financial independence after his death. Every major asset had been carefully protected through legal structures designed to prevent outside interference. The room reacted with visible surprise. Several relatives exchanged confused looks. They had clearly assumed that ownership would automatically transfer according to a much simpler arrangement. Harrison continued explaining. He emphasized that Robert had anticipated potential pressure from family members, business associates, or anyone seeking influence over financial decisions. As a result, specific protections had been established long ago. Jason leaned forward. What exactly does that mean? He asked. Harrison paused before answering. It means that no transfer, sale, restructuring, or management change can occur without Mrs. Carter's direct authorization. The statement immediately disrupted everything Jason and Melissa had been presenting. Their entire proposal suddenly seemed premature. Yet Harrison was not finished. He closed one folder and opened another. This time, the documents appeared much more substantial. Even from where I sat, I could see property maps, corporate records, and ownership certificates. Harrison carefully arranged them on the table. The room became so quiet that I could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning system overhead. Then he looked around the conference room and asked a question that seemed strangely specific. Before we continue, does everyone understand who currently owns this building? Several people glanced around in confusion. Melissa frowned. Jason looked uncertain. No one seemed to know why the question mattered. Harrison slowly adjusted the top document in front of him and prepared to reveal the answer that would change everything. No one answered Harrison's question. The silence stretched across the room as relatives exchanged uncertain glances. Jason looked toward Melissa. Melissa looked toward the conference room windows. Neither of them appeared to know where the conversation was heading. Harrison calmly lifted the top document and placed it in the center of the table. This property, he said, tapping the page gently, has been owned through a private holding structure for several years. He then slid copies towards several family members. I watched their expressions change as they examined the paperwork. At first there was confusion. Then curiosity. Then disbelief. Jason leaned forward and grabbed one of the copies. Melissa quickly did the same. Their eyes moved across the pages. The confidence they had displayed throughout the afternoon began disappearing with every line they read. Harrison continued speaking in a measured voice. Robert Carter transferred ownership interests according to a long-term estate plan that was executed years before his passing. The room remained completely silent. No one wanted to interrupt. Everyone sensed that something significant was about to be revealed. Harrison opened another folder and removed additional records. The building in which we are currently sitting is one of the assets included within that structure. Several relatives immediately looked around the conference room. One cousin actually turned in his chair and stared toward the ceiling as though seeing the building for the first time. Jason's face tightened. "What exactly are you saying?" he asked. Harrison looked directly at him. "I am saying that your father arranged ownership very carefully. He paused for a moment. And according to the legal records, the sole owner of this property is Emily Carter. The words landed like a thunderclap. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Melissa stared at the documents. Jason blinked repeatedly as if he had misheard. Across the table, a relative quietly whispered, "The entire building." Harrison nodded. The entire building. The conference room suddenly felt different. A few minutes earlier, everyone had viewed me as a grieving widow being guided through important decisions. Now they were looking at me with an entirely different perspective. Harrison was not finished. He opened yet another folder. This property is only one component of the portfolio. More documents appeared on the table. Additional ownership records. Revenue statements. Investment summaries. Lease agreements. Every page seemed to increase the level of shock inside the room. Harrison explained that Robert had spent years building a collection of income-producing assets. He had deliberately structured everything to ensure long-term stability for me. The strategy was comprehensive, legal, and meticulously documented. Melissa's hands visibly tightened around the edge of the table. Jason stared at the financial summaries without saying a word. Their proposal, their assumptions, and their expectations had all been built upon incomplete information. Harrison then delivered the final revelation. Mrs. Carter does not require financial supervision. She does not require asset management assistance. She does not require authorization from any family member. He paused and looked around the room. She is fully empowered to make every decision herself. The effect was immediate. The entire foundation of the meeting collapsed in a matter of seconds. Every presentation slide. Every projection. Every carefully prepared document. None of it mattered anymore. For the first time since Robert's funeral, I looked directly at Jason and Melissa. Neither of them could meet my eyes. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had experienced since Robert's funeral. For weeks, Jason and Melissa had spoken with certainty. They had acted as though my future required their guidance. Now neither of them seemed able to find the right words. Around the table, relatives quietly reviewed the documents Harrison had distributed. The atmosphere had shifted completely. People who had previously nodded along with Jason's plans were now looking at me with a mixture of surprise and respect. Melissa was the first to speak. Her voice sounded noticeably softer than before. "Emily, we were only trying to help." It was a familiar sentence. I had heard variations of it for weeks. But now that the truth was out, it sounded different. It sounded less like concern and more like damage control. I looked at her calmly and asked a simple question. "Help me do what?" Melissa opened her mouth but hesitated. No answer came. Jason quickly stepped in. He explained that they had been worried about me living alone. He said they thought managing everything would be stressful. He talked about responsibility and family support. Yet as he spoke, I remembered the folder I had found beneath my couch. I remembered the list of assets with estimated dollar amounts written beside them. I remembered every conversation that somehow drifted toward property, ownership, and financial decisions. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Harrison remained silent beside me. He did not need to say anything. The documents were speaking for themselves. One of Robert's cousins cleared his throat and asked a question that many people were probably thinking. "Did any of us know about this?" Harrison shook his head. Very few people did. Robert preferred privacy. He believed financial matters should remain confidential until the appropriate time. Several family members nodded in understanding. Jason stared down at the table. Melissa avoided eye contact entirely. Then I made a decision. For weeks, I had remained quiet. I had listened. I had observed. I had allowed people to reveal who they truly were. Now it was my turn to speak. I looked directly at Jason first. "At your father's funeral, I heard something that changed the way I viewed everything that followed." His head immediately lifted. Melissa became very still. The room seemed to hold its breath. I repeated the exact words I had overheard in the cemetery parking lot. Once she is gone, everything is ours. The reaction was immediate. Several relatives looked shocked. Others turned toward Melissa. Color drained from her face. Jason closed his eyes for a brief moment. No one denied that the words had been spoken. No one challenged what I had heard. That silence was more powerful than any argument. I explained how the sudden attention, the endless suggestions, the brochures, and the pressure had made me feel. Not angry. Not helpless. Disappointed. I told them that grief was difficult enough without wondering whether people were seeing me as a person or simply as a collection of assets. The room remained quiet. Even Harrison appeared moved by the honesty of the moment. Jason finally spoke. His voice was lower now. He apologized. Melissa followed with an apology of her own. But something fundamental had changed. Their words no longer carried the same weight. Trust, once damaged, does not return simply because circumstances become inconvenient. And as everyone sat around that conference table, they finally understood that the real loss that day had nothing to do with money. The meeting ended shortly afterward, but the effects of that afternoon lasted far longer than anyone expected. One by one, relatives gathered their belongings and quietly left the conference room. Many stopped to speak with me before they departed. Some offered apologies for making assumptions. Others simply wished me well. The mood was completely different from when the gathering had begun. Earlier, people had viewed me as someone whose future needed to be managed. Now they understood that Robert had trusted me with far more responsibility than anyone realized. Jason and Melissa remained behind after everyone else left. Harrison organized his documents and gave me a respectful nod before excusing himself. As the door closed, only the three of us remained in the room. For several moments, nobody spoke. The silence was uncomfortable, but it was also honest. There were no presentations left to give. No documents left to sign. No strategies left to discuss. Finally, Jason looked at me and said something I had been waiting to hear. I should have done better. His voice carried genuine regret. For the first time since Robert died, he sounded less concerned about finances and more concerned about family. Melissa quietly agreed. She admitted that they had allowed assumptions about the future to influence their behavior. Neither of them tried to justify what had happened. Neither of them blamed anyone else. They simply acknowledged the truth. I appreciated their honesty, but honesty after the fact does not erase what came before it. I stood and walked toward the conference room window. Below us, people moved along the sidewalks, focused on their own lives and challenges. The city looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Yet everything felt different. Robert had understood something important. Wealth can solve many practical problems, but it cannot reveal character. Character reveals itself when people think no one is watching. I turned back toward Jason and Melissa. There was no anger left in my voice. Anger requires energy, and I was tired of carrying it. Instead, I spoke calmly. You did not lose access to money today, I said. You lost something far more valuable. Neither of them responded because they already knew what I meant. Trust is difficult to earn and easy to damage. Once broken, it requires time, consistency, and humility to rebuild. I told them that I was not interested in revenge. Robert would not have wanted that. He had spent his life building opportunities, not conflicts. What I wanted was distance, honesty, and time. Whether our relationship could fully recover would depend on choices made in the future, not promises made in that room. A few weeks later, life settled into a new rhythm. I continued living in the home Robert and I had shared. I became more involved in managing the assets he had entrusted to me. Harrison remained a valuable advisor, but every important decision belonged to me. For the first time in many years, I discovered a quiet confidence I had never fully recognized in myself. Robert had not simply left me financial security. He had left me faith in my own judgment. Looking back, I sometimes think about that cold afternoon at the cemetery and the words I overheard near the parking lot. Those words hurt deeply at the time. Yet without them, I might never have seen the truth as clearly as I did. In the end, the greatest gift Robert left behind was not a building, an investment, or a legal document. It was the wisdom to recognize who valued me for who I was and who only valued what they believed I owned.